Thanks for being here tonight. And we continue with where we left off in chapter 16 in Shmuel Aleph, 1 Samuel. Thanks everybody for being here. And let's get right to the text. Okay, let's get right to the text. First, refreshing our memory of the layout of the land. Let's see what we have here. So reminding ourselves that this is the land of Israel. It has not yet been divided into two separate kingdoms, but instead is one country. There will be a civil war that will divide this country in half to a kingdom of the north, Israel, capital Samaria, and the south kingdom of Judea with capital in Jerusalem. But for right now, it's one country under King Saul. And the enemies are all over the place. Edom, Moab, Ammon, Aram. Aram eventually becomes, in modern times, Syria. Here's Damascus. And Ammon and Moab eventually become Jordan nowadays. In fact, the city of Amman, Jordan, Ammon. And on the western side, what today is called the Gaza Strip, it was Gaza Strip then too, that's the Philistines. And the main enemy right now are the Philistines. Saul has been fighting them. And in between, there was the encounter with the Amalekites, Amalek, where Saul, Shaul, failed to heed God's command to wipe them all out. He left the king Agag alive. So the prophet Samuel, was sent to tell the king Saul, number one, his dynasty would not be continued, but at the end of his life, his dynasty would go to someone else rather than to his son Jonathan. He had sinned. And Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, is the one who killed King Agag. Okay. So the king was told he's losing his dynasty, and Shmuel now went at God's command to anoint secretly the new person who will become the new king after the death of Saul. Shmuel, to refresh your memory, was terrified a bit to go. If Saul finds out that he's en route to anoint the successor, while Saul is still king of Israel, Saul will have him killed. So God told Shmuel, go with an animal that you're going to sacrifice. And if anyone asks, what are you doing? Why aren't you in your usual places? What are you doing here? You just tell them you've gone to offer a sacrifice. And he went to the house of Jesse, Yishai, and Yishai had apparently 7 sons. And he looked at each son. He thought, this is a fine, strong, handsome, strapping young man. I guess he's the new king. And God said, not this one, not that one. And through each of the 7 sons, God said, not this one, not that one. And God explained, it's not external appearances I'm looking for, but the heart, the soul, what's inside the person. So there was an 8th son who had not been presented, the youngest among them, and he was out shepherding the family sheep, and that was David. When David was brought before Shmuel, he knew right away, the prophet knew right away, that's the one God intends to have as the new king of Israel. After the passing of Saul, Saul will live his life and only at the end. And then we came back in the story as we concluded last week. From the moment that Samuel anointed David, the Spirit of God that had rested on Saul departed from him and transitioned over to David. And as a result, Saul, with God's Spirit having been removed from him, he didn't realize what it was, but he perceived something no longer was there. And he went into what, for lack of a better term, the text does not call it that, but it seems like a clinical depression, that he no longer was the same. And for the rest of his life, he had his ups and his downs. And his downs were real downs. And his servants began to feel, we've got to do something. And in those days, they did not have the medicines that are given today for people with bipolar disorders or clinical depression. They didn't have those medicines in those days. They didn't have those diagnoses. And they suggested that he should have a harpist come to the palace, a full-time harpist, who whenever he goes into a funk, that the harpist would start playing soothing music. Again, it was a time, there was no television, radio, any kinds of portable music. So we needed an on-site harpist. And as the king, he could have one. And they went and they had no idea that young David the shepherd had been anointed to be the new king of Israel. But meantime, separately, word came back to them that there's quite an experienced, quite an exceptional harpist out there, David, the son of Yishai. And so David ben Yishai, David, the son of Yishai, was drafted to come to the palace and work for the king. And his harp playing was so effective in soothing Saul when he went through periods of deep depression that Saul said he wanted him there full time. He made him his nosei kelav, the person who would be his arms bearer. When Saul went to battle, he wanted David at his side, and David was at his side. And that's where we left off, and that's where we continue now. Chapter 16. Next chapter. Okay. Vayomer Hashem el Shmuel, ad matai ata mitabel el Shaul. So to remind you, we left off that God said to Samuel, you have to stop mourning. You have to do what you have to do. And so he went, chapter 16, and he finally, Vayomer Hashem, kum mishachehu kizahu, God said to Samuel when David showed up, that's the one the word Messiah, Mashiach, mishachehu is the verb. The verb is anoint him. Anoint him. Mashiach, Messiah, means the anointed one. So God says, anoint him. Zehu, because this is the one. So we said, Vayikach Shmuel et Keren HaShemen, Vayimshach Oto B'kerev Achav. So Samuel anointed David in the presence of his other brothers. Vatitzlach Ruach Hashem el David mi'ayom hahu v'hala. And thenceforth, God's spirit rested on David. But at the same time, verse 14, V'ruach Hashem sara me'im Shaul, the spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, leaving him with a ruach ra'ah. He now they don't call it depression, certainly not clinical depression or bipolar. They don't use terminology like that. That didn't exist in those days. There was an evil spirit from God. Something had happened to him. And his servant said, we see there's an evil spirit that's overcome you. And therefore they got someone who was an ish yodeh minagen kinor. Get someone who was a skillful player on the harp. And the word came out that there actually is a guy like that, an ish re'unali mi ish metiv l'nagen. Somebody said, "Nenar'ite ben lishai bet alachmi yodeh nagen v'gibor chayil v'ish milchaman nevon davar." Well, I've seen there's a son of Jesse from Bethlehem. He is skillful in playing the harp, and he's a mighty man of valor. We learned he's younger than his brothers, but younger. He's still in perhaps his 20s. And he's a mighty man of valor, man of war, and he's sensible. When it says prudent in affairs, Navon Davar, he's a sensible person, and he's quite handsome. Ish Toar, and he's very handsome. And so he's got he'll be fine. He might bring some happiness to the palace. So they brought him in, and he came, and he was the man. Right away, immediately Saul loved him greatly. Whenever Saul went into a funk, David would take the harp, V'nigen biyado would start playing, V'ravach l'Shaul v'tov lo, and it would restore Saul's spirit. v'sara me'alav ruach ra'a, and the evil spirit, the depression, would depart. Chapter 17. But before chapter 17, just a very quick midrash. I'd like to share with you a midrash. I'll explain from time to time, I'll explain what the word midrash means. I'll explain it now, but every few months it'll come up. I'll feel I should reinforce. The midrash is a massive collection of, let's call them legends, or and like short aphorisms, short expressions, or short lessons, words of wisdom. And they stem in great measure from stories, legends that are handed down from biblical times. And the thing is, we don't know for sure which midrashim are accurate stories, which midrashim are not exactly accurate, but instead we have them handed down. We sense maybe they're not accurate, but they're still there to teach a lesson. It's like sometimes, I don't know, Aesop's fables. I hate to compare it to something as mundane as Aesop's fables, but it's Aesop's fables we know are fables. They're not true. Why are these stories there altogether? Because Aesop felt that by telling stories, they can grab people's attention and teach a moral that would be easier to grasp and remember if you learn the story. Excuse me. So he taught lessons through stories. The Midrash teaches us lessons through stories. Just so happens a lot of the stories are accurate, but we don't know for sure which ones. So we've preserved them for their lessons more than for their stories. And we have other midrashim, other midrashes that aren't even stories, just teachings. And I'm sharing with you now a teaching. The teaching stems from Shaul, King Saul, not killing that King Agag. He was supposed to kill him. And he showed mercy. And the teaching that we have, it's a very important fundamental teaching in Judaism, comes from Kohelet Rabbah. Rabbah is, without getting into it, Rabbah is like extra material. It's the term used for Midrashim, for Midrashes. And the book of Kohelet is the book of Ecclesiastes. So there's additional Midrashic material on Ecclesiastes. And this is from chapter 7, Parashah 16, before 17. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, and this is a lesson that's taught in Judaism. Anyone who is, first let me read it in Hebrew and then I'll do it in English. We can find Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish Omer, Kol mi shena'asa Rachman b'mkom achsari, anyone who in a place and space that calls for fierceness, almost cruelty, but fierceness and no mercy, in a place that calls for no mercy, anyone who decides, well, I'm going to be merciful anyway, Kol mi shena'asa Rachman b'mkom achsari, anyone who becomes a merciful one in a place where fierceness and non-mercy is called for, Sof shena'asa achsari b'mkom rachaman. In the end, later in his life, it means he's got something screwed up. And in some other case where the circumstances actually call for mercy, you'll see he'll act with cruelty. That is to say, there are people who say, I'm very merciful. And even though the proper thing is to be tough, oh no, I'm more merciful than that. Those kinds of people, in the end, they're cruel when other circumstances arise. And they bring the example, Minayin, Shena'asa achsari b'mkom rachman. Where do we learn this from? Shne'emar. We learn it from, we're going to learn it in about 5 chapters, but it stems from the story of how King Saul was merciful to Agag, the king of the Amalekites. What's going to happen later? It's going to tell us that Saul, that Nover HaKohanim, Ikal Ficharav, Velote Nov Gizar al Shal Amalek. There's going to be an incident later in 5 chapters where Saul, while he's on an extreme depression, and we'll understand the context, gives the order to massacre in a city of Nov, N-O-V, or Nunvet, a city of Kohanim. As you know, the Kohanim, the priests, the Kohens, they serve in Jerusalem. So they were not given a particular parcel of land in the land of Israel when the other tribes were given tribal lands. Tribe of Levi, they were not given land. Instead, the Levium, the Levites, lived in certain cities, and the Kohanim, the Kohens, lived in certain cities, and there was a city of Nov. And Nov was a holy city at biblical times. It's not a city that is on anyone's tourist map now, particularly. But at that time, it was a holy city. It was a city of the Kohens. The Kohanim lived there, many of them. And Saul gave the order to massacre all of them. And the rabbis point, they say, isn't it interesting that the same man who spared the life of King Agag, the most cruel of kings, later massacred the most innocent of people when he went on a significant funk. He was given, and we'll learn about it in 5 chapters, he was given false information that led him to believe they were part of a rebellion against him. But instead of searching deeper, inquiring deeper to say, are they really in rebellion? Is that really going on? He just gave the order to have them all killed. And so it's just something I wanted to mention before we go into chapter 17, since we learned about the story of Agag, we had not done the Midrash. The idea that mercy takes a place, but only up to a point. And there's a certain point where mercy is not appropriate. And I could leave it to you. We don't like to get into deep contemporary politics in our Torah classes. We refer to political matters because, well, life is politics. The things that happen in life are political, and every day. But we leave it to you individually to determine what your particular political take is. But I would just ask you or invite you on your own to contemplate the movement in the last year or 2 or 3. Certain district's attorney in certain inner cities have begun to think of, we're not going to charge bail. When violent criminals are arrested, we feel bail is unfair because rich people can post bail and poor people don't have the money for bail. So bail is unfair to poor people. Therefore, no more bail. And you have this, for example, in Chicago and New York, where people are arrested with knives, attacking someone, hurting someone. And they're arraigned. The judge tells them what they're charged with. They're given a court date to come back, and they're not held. They're sent home the same day. And this is very merciful to the poor. And I leave it to each one of you individually. Perhaps some of you feel this is a good policy. It's an act of mercy. And perhaps some of you feel this is actually a policy of great cruelty. When you read the next day's paper that someone was let out that afternoon and went right back with his knife and knifed somebody else. This concept to know where mercy starts and stops. Each individual can decide. Chapter 17. Well, our friends, the Philistines are back. They weren't gone for long. By Asvu Plishtim et Machaneim leMilchama. Once again, they're ready to go to war. Let's remember once again where they are. We've had nonstop problems with them, haven't we? This goes back to when the Philistines had made war against Eli, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, and they took the ark. And they had his son with the ark, and his son was killed in battle. And then they had the ark, and then God brought plagues on the god Dagon of the Philistines, and then he smote the Philistines themselves with plagues until they finally gave the ark back. And it's been nonstop problems. just had the last 2 weeks, the big battle in which Yonatan killed the Philistine governor and that big war. Well, Philistines are back. Okay, another war. There were a perpetual problem for King Saul. So they're ready to attack in Judea. And so Saul again had to gather his armies together, the men of Israel, to stand ready to stand up to the Philistines. And so they set themselves up for battle against the Philistines. And the way it was set up, there were two mountains, or tall hills, however you want to think of it, and each army set themselves up on a hill, and in between the two hills was a valley. It's common, by the way, in war to find armies setting themselves up on mountaintops, on hills. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Gettysburg with the kids. As they were growing up, we wanted to teach them American history and bring them to some historic sites. And when we went to Gettysburg, it came to life. We all heard of the Gettysburg Address, didn't know what that was. We thought it was like a place that you ask Siri or Alexa to direct you. I'm here, and can you get me to the Gettysburg Address? And who knew what it was? And so finally, I was at Gettysburg Battlefield. In fact, my daughter, my oldest of my three daughters, Yael, did not listen to her parents. She was rambunctious, and she started to climb one of the mountains, and she scraped her arm. And it became an inside joke in the family that Yael gave blood at Gettysburg. So a true American patriot. That what kind of kids are you raising? We're raising patriots. Our daughter gave blood at Gettysburg, at Little Round Top. So the thing is, there were two of the main battle areas were called Little Round Top, and not surprisingly, Big Round Top. And those are two hills. And the northern armies, the southern armies, they staked themselves out. And you can understand why. Think even to Masada and Beitar, the famous battles of the Jews 2,000 years ago against the Romans. You would retreat to a mountaintop, come and get us. That's not so easy to make war. If people are looking to make war, it's hard to make war when the other side is up on a mountain. Now here, both sides are on mountaintops, and there's a valley in between. Vayetze ish habenaim mimachanot plishtim. By the way, I didn't say this, but this is a treat, because this is like one of the all-time famous Bible stories you happen to come out for tonight. So a ish benaim, a representative, a mighty, muscular Arnold Schwarzenegger times 5, not just Mr. Universe, but Mr. Universe, came out from Machanot Plishtim, from the encampment of the Philistines, and his name was Goliath. And for those of us that don't know Hebrew, it transliterates as Goliath. As I said, this is it. If you grow up on that cartoon show, here we go. Anyway, Goliath Shmo Migat. Goliath, his name is Goliath, from the city of Gat, part of the Gaza Strip where the Philistines were based. Govho Sheish Amot V'Zeret. He was 6 cubits plus in height. A cubit is between 1.5 feet and 2 feet. So he's between 9 and 12 feet tall. Let's just call it an even 10 feet. If you follow NBA basketball, which I don't, they have players that are 7 feet. If you're talking about a 5'7" guy, 5'8" guy, so 10 feet is like twice maybe 10 feet is not that much taller than 7, but you don't want to, if you're 7 feet, you don't want to play basketball against a 10-foot guy. And he's the biggest guy they've ever seen. That's why he's the famous giant from the Bible. Goliath the giant. Let's continue. So out comes Goliath, 10 feet tall. Not only does that make him tough, but he has a helmet of brass. So good luck. Vishiryon kaskasim hulavush. And on top of that, he's wearing armor. He's wearing, battle armor. So good luck. He's wearing a brass helmet, battle armor, 10 feet tall, umishkal hashiryon, 5,000 shkalim nechoshet. And they give you the weight of how much weight his body armor was. I can't really translate it for you. Shekels, many people know the word shekel as a word for currency, biblical currency. Modern day Israel's currency also is called, because of the biblical name, they call their currency the shekel. But shekel also is a measure of weight. And so he had a tremendous amount of weight as a 10-foot guy and the idea is he's invincible. He's invincible, he's impenetrable. Even if they had modern day weapons, good luck. Umitzchat nachoshet al raglav. And on top of that, on his legs, he has extra, like a baseball catcher wears knee guards. He's got extra brass protections on his legs. V'chidon nachoshet bein katefav. And he's got extra brass stuff between his shoulders. So he's wearing the arm, he's wearing the arm coat of mail, I guess it's called. And, there's going to be a little bit, just like with my shirt. So with the shirt, there's going to be like a little bit like, So in the same way, he even has a kind of brass scarf, so to speak, that covers that area. So nothing is exposed. He's got the helmet, he's got everything, and he's just like, he's impenetrable. The only thing that's open is his face. I'm sure if he wore glasses, they would be made out of brass. They'd be brasses. But who knows if they had those in those days. But the only thing that's exposed is his face. And he's 10 feet high. Okay. V'chetz chanito gimnor or gim. And then they say he carried a spear with him. Now, in those days, you didn't have rifles. You had spears and swords. And so the text is telling us that his spear was like a beam. Think of a I don't know, a 6-foot beam or an 8-foot beam that stands in a building. That's the length of his spear. And on top of that, it's talking about how the head of the spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. And he's got a shield bearer before him, but I can't imagine that guy carrying that stuff. That guy would have to be pretty big just to carry that stuff. And this gigantic giant, this 10-foot monstrosity, coated in brass, he stands at the top of that mountain and he calls and bellows out across the valley so that the Hebrews can hear him at the other mountain. Why should our two nations and our armies in the hundreds and the thousands have to go to battle and thousands of people are going to die? Hello, Anochi Aplishti, Va'atem Avadim L'Shaol. I'm a Philistine. You all on that other mountain are servants of King Saul. So pick one of you guys, Barula Chemish, pick a guy from your side, V'yered Eli, and let him come to do battle with me. Instead of thousands of us on both sides, turning this into a Gettysburg battlefield with thousands of corpses at the end of the battle, let's face it, one side's going to win and one side's going to lose. So let's spare all the mess. I'll represent the Philistines. You pick a guy to represent your side. We'll have it out. Whichever one wins, that guy's country wins. Whichever guy loses, that guy's country will be slaves to the other side. Im yuchal hilachem iti v'hikani. If the guy that you Jews choose as your champion comes to fight and actually beats me, v'hayinu lachem lavadim, we will submit ourselves to you as your servants. V'im ani uchala, and if instead I'm the one who wins, v'hikitiv, and I slaughter him, I smite him, item lanu lavadim, va'avaditem otanu. In that case, you guys will be our slaves, and you will serve us. Vayomer haplishti, and to make it clear he means business, the Philistine says, Ani cherafti et marchot Yisrael hayom hazeh. I have contempt. Cherafti has like the word cherpa, for those of us that know that word in Hebrew. Cherpa, which is a much more intense version of chutzpah. Cherpa, I have contempt for you. I have utmost contempt. And it's almost like he's cursing at them. It is the Bible. You won't find curses. You won't find foul language in the Bible. Hebrew is referred to as Lashon HaKodesh. Hebrew is referred to as the holy language, partly because it's the language of the Bible, partly because it is a holy language. There's like almost no curses in Hebrew. You go to modern day Israel and you want to curse, the curses that Israelis use at each other in the street curses, either are terms that in English they'd say that's no curse. So for example, the strongest, Vladimir will know some curses. He's a gentle man, but he lived in Israel long enough that I'm sure he heard them in the streets as I did. So like the worst curse in Hebrew is, you son of a prostitute, ben zona. Someone will say ben zona. That's mega fighting words, because it doesn't get, there's no worse insult than that in Hebrew, pretty much. Ben zona. That's what I mean by a holy language. That Lashon HaKodesh, they truly are very careful. The Torah doesn't use bad words. So how do they really curse how do the lowlives curse? They use Arabic curses. All the curses in Israel are Arabic. They borrowed them from our cousins, and that's where they get the real cousin. And that's like the Arabic I learned. Where am I going to learn Arabic? I know 3 or 4 Arabic curses, and I know hummus, and that's it. Okay. So he says, Ani charafti et marchot Yisrael. Basically, he's cursing out. He's essentially cursing out the Jews. He's defying them. He's mocking them. And he says, Tenuli ish v'nilchama yachad. Come on, let's see. Send somebody out. Let's go. Come on. Vayishma Shaul v'chol Yisrael devrei plishti ha'ela. And Saul and all the Jews, as they heard this Philistine's challenge to them, vayachatu vayer'u ma'od, they were absolutely they were shaking in their boots. They didn't know what to do. And so they were terrified. V'David ben ish Ephrati hazeh, mi Bet Lechem Yehuda. Well, you after all do have this young fellow, David. David is there. He's the son of Jesse from Bethlehem in Judea. Ushmo Yishai, v'lo shmon avanim. We've already learned that there's Jesse and his 8 sons, right? The Ha'ish b'mei Shaul zaken ba ba'anashim. And at that time, Jesse was an old man. He had his sons at the battlefield, and the 3 eldest sons of Yishai had gone after Shaul to the battle. The names of those sons that went to the battle were Eliav, the firstborn, and the next unto him was Avinadav, and the third was Shema. So those three sons, the oldest sons, were at the battlefield on the mountain with King Saul. As for David, David was the youngest. And the three oldest followed Saul. And where was David? David was the intermediary for his father. His father was elderly, too old to possibly go to a battlefield, but was deeply concerned that he had all his sons there. And he would send David back and forth to the battlefield. Go to the battlefield, find out how your brothers are doing, and come back and tell me. Do they need anything? Do they need food? I can send them a salami. Tell me what they need. So David went to and from Saul to feed his father's sheep. After all, you can't stop feeding the flock just because there's a war. I mean, that's a serious thing. You know who could tell you that? Barbara Walensky could tell you that. Barbara and Ken Walensky are big patriot Zionists, not just Zionists, a whole nother level. When every year, just about, when they're well and when circumstances allow, they will go to Israel for a period of time and they'll work like in a kibbutz. They'll volunteer in a kibbutz so that people can go on reserve duty, military reserve duty for the Israelis that have to do it. It's a real problem. You're running an agricultural settlement, like a kibbutz or a moshav, and Israel does not have enough manpower to maintain the kind of standing army that the United States has, right? The United States, they have X number of people in the army. Not everybody's overseas. You have people at Fort Benning, Georgia. You have people at Fort Bragg, or whatever they're going to rename it. And you have a lot of American soldiers on active duty who are not yet sent overseas, but they go through basic training, and that's called a standing army. They're in training, they're on duty, and like God forbid during Vietnam, when the call comes that we need more people, we send them from Fort Bragg or Fort Benning or whatever, and they go. So America has a standing army, and Israel cannot maintain that kind of standing army. So they have a standing army, much smaller, but they do have Syria and Egypt and Lebanon and Iraq and Iran. So they also have miluim. They have reserve duty. And every Israeli man till I think age 40 has to give like 1 month a year of reserve duty. He leaves his household and his family for like a month a year to get back into shape. They whip him into shape, and they a little bit of basic training. So if God forbid, there's a war, in addition to the standing army, they have people a little bit more ready. And even those who are not doing their miluim, their reserve duty at that time, they at least would have done miluim a year earlier, let's say. So it's not like you did army's duty at age 20, and now you're 35, you haven't picked up a gun for 15 years. You've done your training even a year ago. You're kind of still up, but as they're calling people to do duty, who's going to keep working the farms? Who's going to work the moshav and the kibbutz? And people like the Walensky's, Ken and Barbara, have very often gone to Israel to volunteer, while others are out doing their reserve duty or whatever. We're here to volunteer to maintain the agricultural output. What can we do for you? And then, of course, there are some people who, when God forbid Israel's at war, have done that. I don't know if you know of people that have done that, but like during the Yom Kippur War, the 6-Day War, the 1982 War, God forbid, when there's one of those kinds of wars. So you'll have volunteers coming, Jews from around the world and others who support Israel, and they'll get off in the airport and they'll basically say, how can you use us? And the country, obviously, we can't just take a guy off a boat from Irvine and put him in the front line in a battle with Syria. But what they can do is, well, we just have to call 50 people from a kibbutz to the front line with Syria, and we could really use some help at the kibbutz working on the oranges. And so that's what David is faced with. The country's at war with the Philistines, but the sheep still have to be watered, and the agriculture still has to be farmed. You can't just let the natural agrarian society break down. because there's a war. So David, since he's the youngest, that's his job. His father felt as among all the others, he should be with the sheep. So David went to and from Saul to feed his father's sheep. On the one hand, he's Saul's armor bearer, B-E-A-R-E-R. And on the other hand, since Saul is not going anywhere right now, he's at the mountaintop and he's no longer marching, he doesn't need somebody carrying his armor to and fro. He's two, whatever. So David's hustling back and forth between the mountain and Bethlehem to do the sheep. Vaigasha Plishti, Hashkem V'Arav, and every day the two armies are still camped on the two mountaintops, squared off, facing each other with that valley in between them. Neither side is charging at the other side. And every day this Philistine, Goliath, Hashkem V'Harev, every morning at daybreak and at night, by Yatsev Arba'im Yom, and this goes on for 40 days. He's challenging them constantly. Come on, name somebody. Vayomer Yishai LeDavid Beno. Meanwhile, Yishai, Jesse, tells his son David, the one who's home, all the others are at the battlefield. He sends some food with him. God knows what they're feeding them in the army. We have a good agricultural setup here. We have a good farm. We're kind of well off. So I'd like you to bring some corn and loaves of bread and bring it to your brothers. Bring them a food kit. The Arutz, Hamachaneli Achecha, run as fast as you can and bring the stuff for your brothers. Now, you know, the commander, the commander's going to see you coming with all this food for your brothers. It may cause dissension. You know, an army relies on teamwork, and we're all members of a unit, a band of brothers. And the idea that the sons of Yishai are eating like a feast while everyone else is maybe eating crummy grub might cause your brothers to be disfavored. Others may decide, oh, they're so special. Well, we'll show them. And the commanding officer may likewise decide, I'm going to have them clean out the latrines, those people who are treated so fit. Let's see how they like that. So Yishai thinks ahead and says, not only do I want you bringing this corn and this bread for your brothers, but also here, bring some cheeses, chalav. I bring cheeses to the captain so that everybody gets the benefit of knowing this family. And that way, your brothers won't get picked on or targeted. And I'd like you to tell them shalom. Tell them hello. Send them my greetings. Tell them I love them. Meanwhile, the battle is going on. There is a battle going on. There's the daily threat by Goliath and his challenge. And meanwhile, there's some fighting going on. Verse 20. Vayashkem David baboka v'toshet atzon el shomer. This day, he left the sheep with a second guy, with an assistant and underling. You can't leave an underling in charge all the time. Eventually, the underling gets lazy, cuts corners, figures the boss is not around, no one's going to notice. But to let the underling step in for one day, you can take that risk. So he leaves the sheep with the underling, but Yisaba Elech, and he goes to the battlefield. Ka'asher tzivahu Yishai, the way his father commanded him, Vayavo Hama'agala, and he reaches the place where, like the front, the barricades. V'chayil Yotze El Hamaracha, V'hereu B'milchama. So at this moment, he's there at the battle, and there's a battle going on. Vata'aroch Yisrael Plishtim, Ma'aracha Likrat Maracha, And the battles are going on. They're shooting catapults at each other. God knows what they're doing. It's not. It's like a long, drawn-out war. It's not like a quick in and out, but it's like the two sides are sort of like catapulting at each other and shooting long-distance arrows at each other. And the battle has been going on now for days, while the Philistine keeps reiterating every day his daily offer of let's bring this thing to an end, one champion from each side against the other. Va'itosh David dakelim alav ayad shomer kelim va'aratz amaracha va'yavo va'yishal echav l'shalom. So David runs to the battlefield, and he leaves behind some of his own guard. Every man of that fighting age would have some basic weapons, some basic protective stuff. He basically drops it so he can run faster, gets to the battlefield. He arrives, he finds his brothers, he wishes them well on his own behalf, on behalf of his father. And he has a conversation, as he's talking with them, even as he's talking with his brothers, catching up with them. What's going on? What's the situation? Here's what's going on with Dad. What should I tell Dad? Dad sent me with this food. All of a sudden, it's interrupted. The conversation stops, this big booming voice. I mean, the only thing that's coming to my mind right now, when we were kids, do you remember the TV commercials? I mean, not that he was such a bad guy, but remember they got Jolly Green Giant? Remember, ho, 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 good things from the valley, valley of the giant, jolly, ho, 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 green giant. So you know that big, gigantic, deep voice, only he's not there with corn or niblets. And so all of a sudden, as he's talking with his brothers, this gigantic, bellowing, deep baritone bass voice by Daber Kadvarim Ha'ela speaks the same words he's been insulting and cursing at the Jewish camp, defying them and mocking them as cowards by Yishma David. And David hears it. And every time this guy on his mountaintop stands up and confronts, even though he's separated from the Jews by a valley, people on their mountaintop start running back. Even though the guy's a distance away, they start running back. They're terrified. It's the word for terror. They were sore afraid, doesn't even begin to define the word yirah. They're absolutely terrified. Vayomer ish Yisrael, hari'item ha'isha oleh zeh, ki l'charef et Yisrael oleh. And one person in the army among the Jews says to the next, do you see this guy? I mean, can you, what do you make of this? Can you see this guy? This guy is cursing us and he's mocking us. And what can we do? Man, if there's somebody among us who feels he can beat this guy one-on-one, the king will make that guy the richest, beyond description. And the king will give his daughter to marry anyone among us who can beat this animal. The king will give everything. He'll give him his daughter. He'll give special to his family. To that young man's family, not only will he get the king's daughter for a wife, but his entire extended family will be given special privileges. Ya'asech of Shiva Yisrael will be given like a free card that could never be drafted by the king. The king can never take any of his lands, and the king will never draft the boys to war, and will never draft the girls to be maids. Vayomer David el ha'anashim dimi molimor. And David hears that and says, so what exactly will be given to the guy who smites that Philistine and brings an end to this disgrace of the Jewish people? Ki mi haplishti ha'arel hazeh, hicheref marchot elokim chayim. Because who in the world is this uncircumcised lout of a Philistine that he should dare defy the armies of the living God? And people said to him, it's like we just said, like we just said, you get the king's daughter, your family will be free of anything, obligation forever and ever and ever, and the king will make you more wealthy than you can imagine. And as young David the shepherd is thinking about it, David's oldest brother Eliav, he sees what's going on, and he decides he's going to take his little brother and he's going to straighten him out right now. And he gets angry at him. Like, come on, grow up. Don't be ridiculous. You're not getting any king's daughter, and you're not going to get any king's wealth, and you're not fighting that Goliath. You're out of, you're a little kid, get out of here. Eliav was angry at his youngest brother. Lama say you're out of there. Why did you even come down here? Why did you even come down here? You're supposed to be with Dad's sheep, with our sheep. It's the family's property. The family's wealth is in its sheep and its cattle. That's your job. What are you doing here? I happen to know, says Eliav, you're a little bit impulsive, aren't you? You're an impulsive guy, and you get into trouble. You came here, you didn't come here to say hello to us. You didn't come here to bring us food or to say that Dad misses us. You came here because you want to be part of the action. You want to watch a war. But Yomer David, and David responds, no, Sitiyat, what did I do? What did I do? What are you starting up with me for? Hello, Davarhu. What do you want from me? But Yisov me'etzlo el mul acher v'yomer k'davar zeh. V'yeshivua am davar k'davar harishon. And so David went away from his brother, and he went to some other people, and he said, so really, like, what's going on here? Is the king really going to give a daughter and wealth? And each guy that he went to said, yeah, that's the word. The word is that's what the king will do to whoever can beat this gigantic guy. And as David started going to different people in the camp saying, do I have this correct? Is that the payoff? The word got back to King Saul, there's a kid. Everybody else there is terrified. No one's start up with the giant. But there's some 20-year-old kid, and we know from the previous chapter when Samuel anointed David, though Saul doesn't know he's been anointed, but we know that David actually is a strong guy. It had described him as handsome and strong and a man of valor. So he's young, but he's in good condition. He's in good shape. And they told Shaul, so Saul called him. What's going on? What's going through your mind? Al yipolev adam alav avdachayelech. He says, no one here should really worry. I, your servant, I'll go. I'll go and fight that Philistine. And Saul said to David, you can't fight this guy to fight against him. You're a young guy. Clearly, this guy is an experienced killer. He's clearly a man of war from his childhood. Take a look at him. You can't, you're a young guy. You're in good shape. It's a shame to see you go. You have no chance. But Yomer David Shaul, David says to Saul, let me tell you something, with all due respect, Your Royal Highness. Ro'eh haya avdecha le'avi. I'm a shepherd, and every day I'm in charge of the flock. I watch my dad's sheep in my role as a shepherd. One day, one day we were ambushed. We were blindsided. I was with the flock of sheep, and from out of nowhere, a lion or a bear. Ari is a lion. Dov, my Hebrew name, is a bear. A lion or a bear showed up and grabbed one of the sheep. What did I do? V'yatzati acharav v'kiti v'tzalti mipiv. I gave run right away. I ran after that lion or bear, and I killed it. And I saved the sheep. Vayakam alai v'chazakti b'skano v'kita v'hamitiv. I went out after him, smote him, delivered the sheep, and when he came back at me, I caught him by his beard. That would be like a lion, and I killed him. So I single-handedly, barehanded, killed a lion. So I, your humble servant, already have killed a lion or a bear with my lion hands and my bear hands. Guess that's what you'd have to say. So with my lion hands and my bear hands, I killed a lion and bear, barehanded. So this Plishti, this uncircumcised Philistine, well, this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them because he dared to curse the armies of the living God. Vayomer David, Hashem Hasher Hitzilani miyad ha'ari u'miyad ha'dov hu'yatzileni miyad ha'plishti hazeh. David said, the Lord God, who saved me when I had to fight barehanded, without weapons, against an attacking lion and bear, that God will save me now against this Philistine. Vayomer Shaul al David, lech b'Hashem yeimach. And Saul said to David, go for it, and may God be with you. Vayalbesh Shaul et David madav, and Saul had David put on the king's armor, v'natan koven achoshet al rosho, and gave David his own helmet of brass, vayalbesh oto siryon, and he dressed him up, with the same kind of protective armor. Vayachgor David et charbo me'al lemadav, vayoel lalechet, and so David now, he also took a sword, and he started to go, but the problem was lo nisa. He found that all that armor, the armor that he was put onto him, was too heavy. He couldn't manipulate. He couldn't maneuver. David said, I can't go and fight this Philistine so heavily armed. I can't move. I don't have experience with this. So he took off the mail, the coat of mail, and he simply took a stick. He took a stick, and he picked 5 stones that he pulled out of a brook. And he had like a little pouch, like a little a purse that shepherds keep. I guess when you go shepherding your sheep, you carry a purse that maybe like a kind of a male pocketbook or purse that maybe has, if it were nowadays, you'd have like a bottle of water and maybe some crackers, whatever it is that he keeps there. So he took it and he put the 5 stones into that purse together with a slingshot. But Yigash el Haplishti, and he approached the Philistine. And this is taking place in the valley. The Philistine comes down from the mountain. He comes down from the mountain. And the Philistine starts plodding closer and closer towards David. And after all, you have a man that's carrying his shield. Now, until now, Goliath was looking at David, the champion of the Jews, coming down from the mountain from a distance. So from a distance, David seemed small. And Goliath assumed he's going to be much, much taller. He just seems small from a distance. Now that he sees him in person, he's saying, son of a gun, this guy really is small. David, when he saw him, he started to mock him. He sees he's a good-looking, smooth-skinned kind of guy. He's a little bit ruddy in the arms, but he's basically like, he's raw. And the Philistine starts mocking him. What do you think I am, a dog? That they're coming at me with a stick? By a kalel haplishti David belokav? And the Philistine cursed David, an evil, evil curse by his God. By Omer haplishti el David, and the Philistine said, come here, come here. That not besar chalof hashemayim levamata sadeh. Come closer. I'm going to give your flesh to the birds in the heaven and to the birds in the sky and to the beasts of the field. Come here. Vayomer David el haplishti ata ba elai. David said, listen, you're coming at me. You think you're so strong. Becherev uv'chanit. You're coming with a sword and with a spear, uv'chidon, and with a javelin. You're heavily armed. I'm coming to you. I don't have a sword or a spear or a javelin. I have God Almighty, the Lord God of hosts, Elokei Marchot Yisrael, the God of the armies of Israel, Asher Cherafta, whom you have mocked. Hayom hazeh yisagercha Hashem bi'adi v'kiticha. On this very day, God will hand you over to my hands, and man, I will smite you. I shall cut your head off of your neck. And furthermore, we will massacre your people, and we will give their carcasses to the birds in the sky and to the beasts of the field. And the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. That God, they will all know that the God of Israel does not fight with swords and with spears, because God alone fights his wars. And he shall hand you over to me. Well, it's 5 minutes after, and we always stop at a cliffhanger, and I don't want to tell you what happens. It'll have to wait till next time. You're just gonna have to wait a whole week to find out what happens in the fight between David and Goliath. And no cheating. Don't go on Amazon and watch those cartoons of David and Goliath. Just have to wait till next Tuesday, God willing. I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks so much for being with me. Bye-bye.